thank you and welcome for coming for our first National Open Source Innovation Summit. My name is Clare Dillon and I am the co-founder of Open Ireland Network. My own journey has been a long one in tech here in Ireland, but in about 2018 I left my role in Microsoft and I began working in a company called Nearform, where I met a wonderful woman called Denise Cooper, who's here in the audience today. And that started me on a journey into the open source world. And for me, it was really an eye-opening experience. I actually had very little understanding about what open source was about. And it really made me think a lot more about where it's being used, how it's driving innovation and efficiencies, more importantly, how it drives both social and economic impact. And I hadn't any notion of any of that before I got started. But it took me on a journey, and I was actually working in this field around the world, and people started asking me what's happening in Ireland. And I'm like, oh, I don't know what's happening in Ireland, and I was there. So I said, I'll come back and I'll actually say what is happening in Ireland. And in 2021, myself and a few others decided to co-found Open Ireland Network with the mission to connect the ecosystem around open source, bring us all together, not at a techie level, not talking about project level details, but really to talk about the kinds of issues and challenges that exist and raise up awareness about the great work that's happening in Ireland around open source. And that was our goal. And the culmination of that is here today. Our journey, we worked initially, we were doing a lot of events online during the pandemic times. We got a lot of folks in the corporate industry. We actually then started working on a skills report, and you'll see some QR codes where you can download that skills report, looking at where the actual skills needs are in Ireland. We subsequently began working in the academic space and partnered with the National Open Research Forum, their MOSI project, or the Managing Open Source in Irish Universities project, and Open Ireland Network were part of the group that was doing that. And then most recently, we're hoping to start working on community of practice for Irish public service. So one of the things about this community is that it spans all the sectors, from business to government, academia, and beyond. And it's really for anyone who's interested in the impact of open source, less than the actual technical details, as it were. And thank you all for coming here today, because this is a culmination of bringing together those diverse audiences, because some of the real benefits of open source is the ability to collaborate in the open and bring together people from different parts of the world in terms of actually doing that. So, as I mentioned, why we are here is because we thought it was time to bring everyone together for a conversation that spans these kind of, I suppose, artificial boundaries of where you sit in your role and what organisation you sit in, and to start talking about where the real power of open source lies, which is about how do you go across organisational and sectoral boundaries to actually get collaborations happening. How do you get innovation moving from, say, the public sector to the private sector and back, and to academia, and how do you get them all working, even across national borders? So really it's about how do we do that, how do we actually use the technology and the innovation that's out there today to make that happen faster and actually collaborate better. And that's really what we're about today. So we'll just get started on that conversation through today's agenda, but I hope we'll get a long way to understanding what we need to do. Now, I can't go any further without saying thank you to our sponsors, without whom this event couldn't have happened. Open Ireland Network started as a volunteer movement, and up until very recently, that's what it was. And in fact, everyone that has been involved in the event here today, most of those have been doing that on a volunteer basis, and so I want to say a huge thank you to them. But we couldn't have actually put on an event of this scale without the help of our sponsors. So I want to say a huge thank you to all of them, and indeed to our event partners who helped us get the word out to the audiences that we knew would be interested in this type of event. So thank you to all of you. We really, really appreciate your support. As I said, thank you to the Open Ireland Network team. We are now actually incorporated as a not-for-profit social enterprise in order to be able to do events like these. But I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who is part of that team, and indeed all the folks that have actually engaged with Open Ireland Network over the past number of years. And indeed to the broader, I suppose, open source ecosystem, many of whom have actually come here today basically because I've been going out badgering them, saying, come to Ireland, please do come, we'd love to see you here. So we've got an amazing array of speakers coming in who have been active in the open source ecosystem for many, many years, and we're delighted and welcome here today to Ireland and to Dublin. We thank you for coming. I thought I would start today by actually just going over a few lessons learned that the lessons I have learned really over the last number of years, because each one of these, I suppose, surprised me to some degree. And so I just want to make sure you're all on the same page as I am now, because, well, of course, open source is all about sharing learnings. So here we are. Maybe the documentation isn't as complete as I would like, but let me just share some of these ideas of what I've learned over the last while. The first thing is open source is everywhere. And again, I suppose the one thing that I really want to point to here is that some people think about open source as it's either open source or it's proprietary software. But the real truth is, of course, that the vast majority of proprietary software is made up of open source software. These days, you can't actually really do software development without touching open source. So whether you look at your smart toaster or your phone in your pocket or your web app, any web app, or whether you're thinking about the technology that runs our energy grids or our health systems, or if you're looking at, I don't know, all the way to Mars and thinking about the Mars rover, open source is everywhere. It's actually contained, 96% of the world's software, whether it be proprietary or open source, contains open source software. So this is everyone's business. It's important for everyone to understand both the opportunities and challenges that relate to open source software if you're in the business or even if you're interacting with technology. And indeed, a lot of actual software originates from open source software as well. So I'll leave these reports, you can go and have a look at them, but essentially, it is everywhere. And of course, the reason why it is everywhere is because it is so easy to actually use open source software and to contribute to it. So the 4 freedoms of open source are that it's free to run for any purpose, anywhere you might be. You can actually, without any limitations, you can run open source software on your machine, and that's what makes it so easy for developers to pick up the things they need to fix their problems. It's free to share, because you can actually then share it to other people who you know have the same problem. It's free to study it, to learn about it, and then to modify it, which is really important for people to be able to take what they see and then be able to see, well, does it suit my needs? If not, I can make the changes I need to actually make it suit my needs, and then distribute the end result. So these are the freedoms that open source give people, and that is the reason why it is spread quicker than any other technology and is the backbone of the world's technology industry today. And so then I would say, why now? Why is the open source movement now so important? Because it's been around for a while, right? And it's been slowly, I suppose, broadening out in terms of people being aware of what it is and what it can do into the broader ecosystem. But I think there are a couple of reasons in today's world why it's particularly important. The first is, of course, what I mentioned, the frictionless code reuse, being able to use other people's technology. The second is that it speeds things up. And this is not just in terms of from a technical perspective. It just means that if you have a problem you need to solve, you can either go out and start thinking about purchasing it and maybe IP licensing and all these other things around that's grown up around the technology industry. But in the open source world, you can just take what you need and get that problem fixed there and then. And that's what's so important and why it speeds things up. But also because it spreads quicker. So once a problem is solved, developers are very good at sharing the fact that they solved a problem in the world, and so that spreads out in the ecosystem quicker than perhaps other technology. The next thing is that it allows people to pool their resources, and that is important in times where budgets may be tight, and suddenly it's not really the most sensible thing to build 15, 20, 300 versions of the same thing. Why wouldn't we just share something multiple times? Or share the cost of building something together? And that also shares the risk, because it means then people don't necessarily have to have individual risk related to that. Finally, the social and economic impact is important, and that has now been proven to be the case. And indeed, there's increased trust because you can see the code. It means people trust the technology better. And in these days of, I suppose, decelerating trust or a lack of trust in many institutions and in people and organizations, it can be a very important thing to actually build trust in technology. Before I go into that, I just want to say, actually, there's one thing I missed on this slide, and I probably should have put it in here because I think it's one of the things that we don't talk about enough. Open source makes developers happy. Collaborating makes developers happy. And it's probably one of the factors that doesn't get mentioned because it's not something that maybe turns up in an organizational strategical review as to what their goals are for the year, but it's why it works. And collaborating in this way means that people get more purpose and have more social connections, and they like that, and it makes them better, more productive people. And of course, all of this is, I suppose, amply, the example of open source AI is just where this is really coming home to be. This is where it's all happening. I don't think anyone could have missed all the discussions about in the last number of months and even weeks or days, actually, in terms of OpenAI, AI, open source AI. Many of you may have seen this leaked memo from Google in the early days, which is where they were saying that, we don't have a moat and neither does OpenAI, because open source is the one thing that will actually outcompete us all. That was a long time back, and people were kind of, in AI years, it was a long time back, and people were kind of pointing to that as being something that would, I suppose, talk to what was coming in the future. But then, just after the US announced this whole $500 billion investment in their big, closed, proprietary AI solution just a few weeks ago, and everyone, I think, in the rest of the world were like, how will we compete with that? Like, how do we pull together $500 billion and actually get what we need to actually compete in this space? Then along comes DeepSeek, made available with this code and the weights under as open source. And DeepSeek, of course, was made available, could be used freely, and not only was showing performance that was equivalent to some of the best-in-class foundation models, but then, as well as that, took a fraction of the cost in terms of the training and the resources needed to run it. And I think for me, and for everyone that I know of, it was just proof that the open source models are surpassing proprietary ones. And this is what Jan LeCun said when he was talking about it. It's not this idea of China and the US. This is about closed models and open models, and how quickly open source can actually catch up on and potentially accelerate past closed proprietary models. And then it's quite gratifying to see Sam Altman go, yeah, you might be right, maybe we were wrong. Maybe we're on the wrong side of history because we actually kept closed source AI. So all of that story, just for me, was a perfect example, an embodiment of what we're talking about today. And then, it's a good thing I didn't finish my slides on time, because just as I was about to submit them, we got the news that there's a multi-million-dollar investment coming from Europe, where they're building a series of foundation models. There's a consortia of high-performance computing centers all across Europe coming together to build Open Euro LLM, which I don't know much about, but I thought I would share with you because it's hot off the press. But this is, I suppose, an example of open source AI pulling together, running on European open data sets for and serving the needs of European citizens, which is great. So, open source is everywhere. I'm only in lesson 1. I'm going to speed up. Okay, so lesson 2, and this is controversial in some circles, but I don't think the answer is always open source. So you may say, Claire, you're an open source advocate, and I am, but actually I'm an advocate for using it where it makes sense. Because this is not about, it can only be all open source or it can only be all proprietary. I think what we need to recognize is the fact that the world technology today is more complex than that, and sometimes it makes sense, but sometimes it doesn't make sense. So for example, if there's a proprietary solution already sitting there and you've already got it, why would you chuck it out to maybe build something in open source? There may be reasons actually, but maybe there are, maybe not. Maybe you don't have the right skills to actually adopt it and use it. Maybe you want to make millions over IP licensing, and there's people who want to do that, but then there's other people who just want to get their technology faster out there. Maybe there's people who want to have social impact. And for all of those reasons, you have to make the choice about whether you want to go for open source. And if you do, you have to be willing to invest to make it work, which is important as well. So sometimes people are not willing to invest time and effort to make open source work. And if that's the case and you're not willing to make that investment, then maybe it's not for you. So I just want to make this case to say, for me, it's where it makes sense. And part of the skills we need to build as an industry is understanding where it does make sense. And when it does make sense, how to do it right. Next lesson. It has a social and economic impact. Now, I'm not going to dwell on the social impact, because can I show of hands? Who thinks open source has the potential to have social impact? There we go. So good. Almost a mic drop. Okay, so we've done that one, right? So, but I do think that, the reasons why it makes social impact is so different. Everyone can get it. Global accessibility gives everyone the power to get the latest technology. But it also brings in diversity. Because if we closed our eyes right now and you imagine the people that are building the technology that is going to impact our lives, who do you want them to be, right? Do you want them to be all male, white, living in a particular place with a particular ideology? Or do you want a diverse set of people working on the technology that's going to impact our lives? And open source gives the potential not just to encourage diverse participation, but to allow for innovation in the most surprising places. Because it comes from everywhere, and we cannot rule out that the next person who has the most amazing innovation to lend is sitting somewhere that right now they don't have access to the capital to be able to be in a big company and do the right thing. But if they have open source and access to that, they can be part of a community and get their innovation to the world. But I want to talk about the economic impact, because people forget about that, and sometimes they think, oh, it's all social impact, it's all for the social good. If I'm not into that, what about the hard-nosed economics? Well, it turns out, even for the hard-nosed economics people, there is now proof that open source has economic impact above and beyond closed source. And there was a recent report commissioned by the European Commission, who actually, and published by Open Forum Europe, where they are proven that there is an actual GDP correlation, an increased GDP with open source being created in a region that causes knock-on effects to the innovation ecosystem, the ability for innovation to diffuse quickly, and effectively, if you increase your open source contributions by 10%, then you get more startups too. So good for everyone in the room from an economic perspective. Next lesson is that we have an unsung story here in Ireland, right? When I was in the global open source community, someone once said to me, I don't want to call Ireland a laggard, but, and they went on to call us a laggard, right? Because we haven't talked much about what's happening in Ireland. It's one of the reasons why I thought Open Ireland Network was so important. But we have loads of open source leaders sitting here in the country. They just don't talk to each other or bother to say that they happen to be board members on foundations or project leads in Apache or whatever. But they're everywhere. And I can't go almost a day without finding out some massive, big project that's actually being conducted with open source as output here. But we don't talk about it enough, and we don't shine a light and celebrate those people. And you'll hear some of those stories here today, and that's one of the reasons why we're all here today as well, to actually hear some of those stories. And indeed, even if you're just looking at the actual numbers, GitHub's innovation graph allows you to, it may not be 100% accurate, but it allows you to get an idea about how many developers are in each geographic country. And if you look at the big overall summary, of course Ireland is a small bar, and you kind of think, okay, like we're way down, we're a little tiny bar at the bottom. But if you look at it per capita, we are 6th in the EU. 6th. We're above all the big countries that have all the big programs and all the big funding. And we're up there with people like Estonia and the Nordics and Netherlands, who are actually also very active in the space. But 6th, that surprised me. I hope it will surprise you. Do not let anyone say that we are laggards in the space, because all we need to do is actually make people aware of what we're doing. So, lesson number 5, it's grown up. And this may be a consequence of the technology industry also growing up, because there was a time when everyone wanted to move fast and break things, which is fine if you're experimenting in a little pilot website, web app thing. It's not so fine if you're building the technology that's making my pacemaker or running my electricity grid or my hospitals. So you want to grow up. So I think it's moving to, or shifting to, move fast with guardrails. And that's where regulation comes in, that's where compliance checks comes in, that's where security comes in. And again, some of these topics will be talked about today because they're important to understand and how to use them and how to leverage these new regulations, even for a competitive advantage. Lesson 6, open source is more than code, because it's not just about the source code. If anyone thinks it's just about the source code, you're missing why this is so successful, because so much of it is about what surrounds the source code, like the people and the processes. I myself started actually looking at just the processes used in open source. If they're used to create proprietary software, that's called InnerSource. That's my topic of my PhD that I'm working on. These processes are incredibly important, incredibly productive, and incredibly good at helping people collaborate. The people connections, though, that's where the magic happens. Because if you have connections by sharing and working together on code with people who are the experts in that field, then you are better positioned to be successful in that field. So lesson 7. So good, I have to say it twice. So open source is more than just software code. It's actually just scratching the surface. We're not even talking about open source hardware. That's a whole other topic. Opportunities, you could even say are even bigger in that area, because there's so much to actually talk about what people are doing in that space. Lesson number 8. Just in case you didn't get the message, open source is more than code, because one of the most important things I think about this, and again, probably one of my biggest aha moments, was that open source is as much about learning and sharing learning as it is about using the code. Because there's nothing that developers like more than looking at someone else's code to see how they did it, possibly just to say, I knew I could do it better. But nonetheless, it is a learning experience, and you're either learning by doing, or you're learning by lurking and looking at what all the experts are doing. And that is a really key thing to understand when we think about skills. Because developers are not often the types that want to sit down and go through an hour-long presentation and suddenly they turn out to be better developers. They learn by doing, they learn by looking at what the experts are doing, and that's what open source allows you to do. Lesson 9, it is not free. I mentioned earlier about the investment you have to put in, but the freedoms that come with open source are not about cash freedoms. It's been said before, it was said to me last night by Bill Higgins in the room, or whenever we were talking about it, it's not like free beer, it's like free like a puppy that you have to take care of. So they're really great, we love them, they steal our hearts, but to be honest, they can be hard work, right? So open source is not free. If you're going to invest in open source, be sure you're ready to build the skills that you need to do it, make sure you're ready to invest, to maintain it. And really, when we think about the economic efficiencies, it's not because you're getting something for free. It's because you are sharing the investment to get to where you need to go. That's where the efficiency comes in. That's why it is economically sensible. Last lesson. In the immortal words of George, Michael, and Wham, if you're going to do it right, right? Okay? So the last lesson is, if you're going to do open source, and let's face it, everyone is doing open source whether they know it or not, if you're touching technology, then you want to do it right. And that means learning the skills that are particular to the open source ecosystem to understand how to consume it responsibly, how to make sure that you're maintaining it, how to, as a nation, how we can think about, where we're putting open source and how we actually check that, what are our dependencies, how do we ensure those dependencies are sustainable in the future. There are so many skills that appear that, again, aren't just particular to the open source industry, but in this particular scenario, and where we're going with the technology, we want to make sure we get it right. So if you're going to do it right. I'll get the soundtrack later. And help us at hand, because this is a wonderfully collaborative community. So if you don't know how to do it right, then this is where you come and you can learn about it. So today, we have a packed agenda. Thank you again, everyone who's been contributing to that. We are starting with a series of opening addresses just to check where we're at, check the landscape, see what's happening in the world, in technology, industry, in the industry verticals, in government, at a UN level. And we are hearing from a range of people to share that, academia too, because it's so tied to open research. After the break, which will be coming at 11 o'clock, we will be building on those themes in this room and hearing more along those lines. But then there's also a track which I have titled Open Source 101, because it's introductions to some of the best practices. So I mentioned about doing it right. And if you want to learn more about people who are doing it right, then that is happening in this room just next to me here, where we'll be learning a little bit more about the business basics, licensing business models, how to set up responsible management practices, how to assess project health, and then also how the big, large organizations, and indeed small organizations, are managing their open source using the construct of an open source program office. And we'll be hearing all about that there. After lunch, in case we weren't busy enough, and I didn't give you too many difficult choices, there are 4 tracks to choose from. That is the business track, the government track, the academic track, and the open source and AI track, which is obviously always popular. But there are breaks in between each of those sessions. So I will say the moderators and the MCs in the room have been warned to keep us on time. They will be brutal, so that we stop on time to give people a chance to actually change tracks. So that's what's happening there. And there's a series of those sessions. There will be coffee available for the entire time, and you can fuel up as you go. It is subject to change from the actual printed agenda due to, unfortunately, some of the folks that can't make it. And again, I want to thank some of the speakers who stepped up at the very last minute to come on board. So be prepared for change, but we're all agile people here, so I think that's all going to work. And then I hope to see you later at the reception at 5:30. So that's the system for today. We are going to kick started with our whistle-stop tour of everything that's happening in the open source world. So I am delighted. Oh, and I forgot to say this is just the start. Today is just the start. Don't forget that this is just one event, but we do hope that everyone here, if you haven't already, will sign up to Open Ireland Network and help us even decide what the next steps are in terms of priorities about what we all may need to address together. Because it is about how do we all work together in Ireland, and I think that's the unique opportunity we have here, is that we can all work together, possibly more easily than places where people have more separation between them. So that's the goal, and enjoy the rest of the day.